The whole room laughed when Camille Sterling pointed at the rusted car under the tarp in the corner of her dead father's garage and told the quiet man in the worn jacket that he could have it. It happened at the estate auction, in front of 40 people holding champagne, and she said it the way you say a thing you already know will get a laugh. She had watched this man drift along the edges of the room all evening, this nobody in a clean but tired jacket who did not belong among the tailored suits, and when she heard him say, quietly, to no one in particular, that the dust-covered wreck in the corner seemed like something worth saving, she had decided to make him the entertainment. She crossed the marble floor with her heels clicking, pulled an old brass ring of keys from a drawer, and threw them at his chest so that he had to catch them or let them fall. My father kept that pile of junk his whole life, for no reason anyone could ever explain, she announced, loud enough for the back of the room. If you want it so badly, take it. Consider it a parting gift. To the help. The laughter that followed was the kind that is meant to make a man small. And the man in the worn jacket, who had caught the keys against his chest, looked at them in his open hand for a moment, and then looked at her and said one word, "Thank you." That was all. He did not argue, did not explain himself, did not give the room anything more to laugh at. He closed his hand around the keys, turned, and walked out toward the garage with the same unhurried calm he had walked in with. And the strange thing, the thing Camille Sterling could not stop turning over in her mind for the rest of that night, was that his composure unsettled her far more than any anger would have. What no one in that room knew, what Camille herself would not understand for 2 more weeks, was that the man she had just humiliated was the one person on earth who could look at that rusted wreck and see what it actually was. And what it actually was, buried under 40 years of dust and a deliberately falsified badge, was the single most valuable lost automobile in the country, a vehicle that collectors and historians had hunted for 4 decades, worth, when the gavel finally came down, more than $8 million. His name was Keanu Reeves, and before this story is over, that rusted car would rewrite everything Camille Sterling thought she knew about her father, about herself, and about the man she had reduced to a punchline in front of a laughing crowd. But to understand any of it, you have to understand Keanu Reeves first. And you have to understand why a man who could see what no one else could see was standing at the edges of that room in a worn jacket, expecting nothing, noticed by no one. There had been a time years earlier when Keanu Reeves was known for something other than the quiet work he did now in a leased garage, on the edge of a small town in the mountains of western North Carolina. He had been, in that earlier life, a brilliant mechanical engineer, the kind of mind that firms competed to hire, the kind that could read a blueprint the way other people read a street sign, finding meaning in lines and tolerances that looked like noise to everyone else. He had designed systems that other engineers studied years later without knowing whose hands had shaped them. He had been respected, sought out, asked his opinion at industry dinners by men who genuinely wanted to know what he thought. And then he had walked away from all of it, and the reason he walked away was a man named Augustus Hartley. Gus Hartley had been an old master restorer, a man who had spent 60 years bringing dead machines back to life in a barn full of tools that had belonged to his own father before him, and he was, in every way that counted, the man who had made Keanu who he was. Keanu had wandered into that barn as a young man, half lost, and Gus had handed him a wrench and never really let him leave, had taught him not only how a machine worked, but how to listen to one, how to read the story a piece of metal told about the hands that had shaped it and the years it had lived through. Gus used to say that a machine remembers everything, that if you knew how to look, you could read a man's whole life in the way he maintained his car, that the things people thought were just objects were never just objects. They were diaries written in steel. There was a particular way Gus taught, which was mostly by not teaching. He would set a ruined thing in front of Keanu Reeves and say almost nothing, and wait and let the young man be wrong for as long as it took, and only when Keanu had exhausted every clever theory would Gus grunt and point at the one detail that mattered, the hairline crack, the mismatched bolt, The place where someone 40 years ago had done a repair in a hurry, because something in their life had gone wrong that week. Gus believed that anyone could learn the parts of a machine, but that almost no one was willing to learn its patience. To sit with a thing long enough for it to tell you the truth, and he had spent years sanding the impatience out of Keanu, the way you sand rust off a fender. Slowly, down to the clean metal underneath. By the time Gus was an old man and Keanu was no longer young, the two of them could work side by side for a whole afternoon in the barn without speaking, and it was the most comfortable silence Keanu Reeves had ever known. And he did not know, until it was gone, that it had been the closest thing to a home he had ever had. Keanu had loved him the way you love the person who shows you who you are. And 3 years before the night of the auction, Gus Hartley had died, slowly. In a bed Keanu sat beside long after visiting hours ended, and something in Keanu had simply stopped chasing the life he used to want after that. He left the career, he left the salary and the respect and the dinners. He took the small inheritance Gus left him, which was mostly tools and books, and a reputation that meant nothing outside a small world. And he opened a modest restoration garage on the edge of town. The kind of work that paid in cash and gratitude rather than bonuses. The kind of work that let his hands stay busy while his mind stayed quiet enough to get through each day. And he took in Heiress. Heiress was 9 years old, and she was the daughter of Keanu's younger sister, who had died 2 years before Gus did, and her father had been gone long before that. And so when there was no one else, Keanu had become the one else. He was her guardian now, this quiet man, and this small girl in a rented house at the edge of the mountains, and most days that was the whole shape of his life. He picked her up from school. He made dinner from whatever stretched across the week. He read to her at night from a book she had long since memorized. He was not, he knew, especially good at least not in the ways he worried about. He could rebuild an engine blind, but he could not braid hair, and he had learned by failithing in front of a patient 9-year-old. He did not always know what to say when Heiress asked about her mother, and so he had decided early to tell her the truth in small, honest pieces, rather than one large, rehearsed speech. And that seemed to be working. Or at least she still climbed into his lap on the bad nights, which he took as evidence he had not ruined anything yet. He had a way of explaining things to her that came straight from Gus, setting a problem in front of her and waiting, letting her be wrong, pointing at the one detail that mattered only after she had worked at it. And she had his patience already at 9. Or maybe she had her mother's. He could not always tell. And the not being able to tell was its own small grief. The house smelled faintly of motor oil no matter how he scrubbed. And the porch light flickered every other night. And there was a child asleep down the hall who was his now. And on the good evenings, Keanu Reeves would stand in the kitchen doorway and look at the light under her door and feel something that was not quite happiness. Because happiness was a country he had stopped expecting to visit, but was adjacent to it, was in the next valley over. And some nights that was enough. People in his old life had once shaken his hand and asked his opinion. People in his new life barely noticed him at all, and most days he told himself there was a kind of peace in that, in being invisible, in not having to perform anything for anyone. He had only gone to the Sterling estate auction because a friend mentioned there might be a few old engines worth looking at among the late billionaire's belongings. Nothing more. He had no expectation of belonging in a room full of champagne and tailored wool. He arrived in a jacket that had been pressed carefully but could not hide the years it had lived. And he moved along the edges of the crowd, the way a man moves when he has stopped expecting to be seen. And to the wealthy guests drifting between the marble columns, he might as well have been part of the building. Nobody looked at him twice. He preferred it that way. He was there for the machines, for the quiet language of metals and design that had always made more sense to him than the language the people around him were speaking. Now you should understand the man whose estate it was, because he is the secret at the center of all of this, and because everything that happened flowed from a thing he did and never explained. Arthur Sterling had died at 78, and his name was stitched into the region the way the names of certain men get stitched into places, onto hospital wings and scholarship funds, and the sides of buildings. A self-made billionaire who had given interviews and stood for 1,000 photographs at ribbon cuttings, and built an empire that employed half a county. The public Arthur Sterling was a known quantity, generous and shrewd and always on camera. But the private Arthur Sterling, the one almost no one had ever met, had kept a single secret for 30 years, guarded more carefully than anything else he owned, and the secret was sitting under a tarp in the corner of his garage while his daughter gave it away as a joke. And his daughter, Camille Sterling, was 36 years old, and she had inherited not only her father's fortune, but a kind of practiced coldness that had made her a fixture in the social columns. Known for arriving late to her own charity events, for speaking to the staff as though they were furniture, for a thin photograph-ready smile that never reached her eyes. She was not, despite all of it, a stupid woman, or even underneath everything, a cruel one by nature. She was something sadder and more common than that. She was a person who had been raised inside enormous wealth by a father who was almost never there, and who had learned, somewhere along the way, to measure her own worth and everyone else's in the only currencies her world seemed to respect, and to keep everyone at a distance so that no one could see how much it had cost her to become that way. Her coldness was armor, but armor and cruelty look identical from the outside, and from the outside, that night, Camille Sterling was simply cruel. She had built that armor early, and she had built it, though she did not know this yet, in direct response to the very man whose estate was now being auctioned. As a girl, she had waited for her father at windows. She had a specific memory, one she had not let herself look at in years, of being 7 and dressed for a school recital and watching the driveway for headlights that did not come, and of the housekeeper finally gently telling her that Mr. Sterling had been held up at the office and would see the video. There had been a lot of videos. Arthur Sterling had watched his daughter's childhood the way you watch a country you have emigrated from, fondly, from a great distance, on a delay. And a child cannot understand that the distance is fear, that the absence is a kind of terrible love, that the father staying away has convinced himself he is building something for her that matters more than his presence. A child only understands that the headlights did not come. So Camille had done what children do, which is to decide that if she did not need him, it could not hurt her when he was not there. And she had practiced not needing him until not needing anyone became the truest thing about her, until the armor fused to the skin, and she could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. By 36, she was very rich and very polished and very alone, and she had stopped noticing the alone the way you stop, noticing a sound that never stops. And she threw a set of keys at a stranger in a worn jacket and called him the help, and she had no idea, none at all, that she was her father's daughter in the one way that mattered most, which was that she too hid the thing she most wanted, behind the thing that looked most like contempt. It was while wandering past the open garage doors at the back of the estate, away from the noise, that Keanu first noticed the car. Most of the garage was full of gleaming vehicles the auction house had already cataloged, each polished to a showroom shine, each with a little placard describing its history. But one car sat apart from the others, unlisted, untouched, pushed into the shadows where the overhead lights barely reached, with only a sliver of its frame showing under a heavy canvas tarp, a curve of metal. That was all most people would have seen, an old wreck waiting for the scrapyard. But Keanu was not most people, and his eyes, trained by 60 years of Gus Hartley's voice in his head, caught something in that exposed edge. A shape, a proportion, a memory of something he had read about in an old technical journal years ago during a long night spent chasing automotive history simply because it fascinated him. He felt his pulse shift, just slightly, the way it used to when he was young and chasing a problem no one else could solve, the way it had not felt since before Gus died. He knelt by the tarp, careful not to disturb anything, and he looked at that curve of metal for a long time, turning it over against fragments of memory, comparing it silently to photographs he had not seen in years. He told himself it was probably nothing. He told himself his imagination was reaching for excitement in a life that had grown very quiet. But the part of him that had never stopped being Gus Hartley's student, the part that knew a machine remembers everything, refused to believe it was nothing. He stood up slowly, glanced around to be sure no one had seen his interest, and walked back toward the main hall with the image of that hidden frame lodged in the back of his mind. And then, near the dessert table, he made the mistake of saying what he thought, quietly, to a small group of people who had no interest in hearing it. He said, "The dust-covered car in the garage seemed like something worth preserving rather than discarding. That even forgotten machines sometimes carried stories worth uncovering before they were lost." He said it without agenda, the way a man says a true thing into a room. And Camille Sterling heard him from across the floor and turned and decided to make him the evening's entertainment, and crossed the marble and threw the keys and said the words about the help, and the room laughed. And Keanu said thank you and walked out, and that should tell you something about him, the thank you. It was not sarcasm. He had wanted the car since the moment he knelt by the tarp. She had just handed him, as an insult, the one thing in that entire glittering estate he actually wanted. And he was not going to let her cruelty take from him the simple truth that he was grateful to have it. So he thanked her, and meant it, and left, and the meaning it was the thing she could not get out of her head. She told herself, that night, that it did not matter, that he was simply a stranger who would vanish from her life as quickly as he had entered it. But the thought lingered uncomfortably at the back of her mind, through the rest of the reception, surfacing between conversations she was barely listening to. She kept replaying the small scene, looking for the part where she had won, and not finding it. She had thrown the keys. The room had laughed. By every rule she had ever lived by, she had come out on top of the exchange. And yet the man had walked away looking less diminished than she felt, and that arithmetic refused to balance. And Camille Sterling was a person who hated, more than almost anything, an equation she could not solve. Somewhere underneath her irritation, though she would not have been able to name it that night, was the first faint suspicion that the rules she had always lived by might not measure the things she had assumed they measured. She pushed the suspicion down. She was very good at pushing things down. She had been doing it her whole life. It took Keanu and a borrowed flatbed most of the next morning to haul the car back to his garage. The engine had seized completely after decades of neglect. The tires were flat and cracked. His friend Roy Calderon, who owned the truck, asked more than once why he was bothering with what looked by any reasonable measure like a worthless pile of rust. And Keanu just said he wanted a closer look before he decided what to do with it. Once it was settled under the fluorescent lights of his workshop, in the familiar smell of oil and metal that was the backdrop of his whole life now, he spent hours simply walking around it, running his palm along the dented fenders, studying the way the metal had been shaped along curves that were far too deliberate for any mass-produced car. And the deeper he looked, the stranger it got. The chassis number stamped into the frame matched no manufacturer record in any of his reference books, which should have been impossible for a car claiming to come from any production line he knew. Several components under the hood were clearly handcrafted rather than stamped out, fitted with a precision that spoke of one person building one thing by hand, rather than a factory building 10,000. And the badge on the grille, faded almost to nothing under the grime, had been swapped, replaced with one that did not belong to the make. It was pretending to be, as though someone had deliberately disguised what the car actually was, so that no one who came looking would find it. It was the badge that stopped Keanu cold, because Gus Hartley had told him about exactly this, years ago in the barn, late at night. Gus had said that the rarest machines in the world sometimes hid in plain sight, wearing the wrong face on purpose. Because a man who wanted to protect something precious from a world that would take it knew that the best hiding place was contempt, that nobody steals what everybody thinks is junk. Keanu had filed it away as one of the old man's stories. Now he was kneeling in front of one. He did the work the way Gus had taught him, which meant he did it slowly, and he did it in order, and he wrote everything down. There is a discipline to authenticating a machine that almost no one outside the world of serious restoration understands. And it has very little to do with excitement, and almost everything to do with patience. You do not start by deciding what a thing is and then looking for proof. You start by assuming it is ordinary, and you try honestly to prove that it is ordinary, and only when the ordinary explanation fails again and again, only when every attempt to make the thing mundane collapses under the weight of the evidence, do you allow yourself to consider that it might be extraordinary. Keanu Reeves had spent a career doing this with engineering problems, and Gus had spent a lifetime doing it with machines, and the method was the same. He measured the wheelbase and compared it against every production model of the era and found no match. He examined the casting marks on the engine block under raking light and found foundry signatures that belonged to no factory in his books. He looked at the welds, and the welds told him the truth that mass production never tells, which was that a single human being had stood here, once, and made each joint by hand, and cared about each one. A factory builds 1,000 identical things and cares about none of them. A person builds one thing and pours himself into it. Keanu had spent enough years reading welds to know the difference the way you know a friend's handwriting, and these welds had been laid down by someone who loved what he was building, and that, more than any serial number, was the first thing that made Keanu believe. That night, after Heiress was asleep, he pulled out a stack of old technical journals and historical catalogs he had collected over the years, material most people would have thrown away, and he spread them across the kitchen table and went looking. He cross-referenced sketches and engineering notes and grainy black and white photographs until his eyes ached under the single overhead bulb, and what he found near midnight made his hands go still. The car bore the characteristics of an experimental prototype that had vanished from the historical record 4 decades earlier, one of the rarest and most sought-after vehicles in automotive history, a machine that collectors and historians had spent careers searching for, without ever confirming it still existed. If he was right, the thing sitting in his garage was worth more than he could comfortably let himself imagine. But Keanu was a careful man, shaped by Gus and by engineering both, and he had a deep respect for evidence over hope, and he refused to let what he wanted to be true outrun what he could prove. So he made a decision that night. He would begin a full restoration, slow and methodical, and he would treat every bolt and panel as evidence rather than just a part, documenting each component he removed, photographing serial numbers and casting marks before he set anything aside, building a case the way an investigator builds a file, not because he wanted the money, because he wanted to know the truth, and because, somewhere underneath, Gus Hartley was watching, and Keanu had never once done careless work in front of that man, alive or dead. The discovery that changed everything happened almost by accident, a week into the work. Late one evening, when Keanu was carefully removing the original driver's seat to check the frame underneath for rust, his fingers brushed against something that did not belong, a seam in the upholstery that felt slightly raised, slightly wrong against the symmetrical stitching everywhere else on the seat. He worked the stitching loose with a thin blade, slow and patient, careful not to damage whatever was underneath. And he found a hidden compartment built into the base of the seat, added long after the car had left whatever hands had built it, a modification no factory would ever have included. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth against decades of dust and damp, he found a worn leather notebook, a small stack of photographs with curling edges, and several handwritten letters folded into careful thirds. He sat with the oilcloth bundle in his lap for a while before he opened it, because he understood immediately that he had crossed out of one kind of discovery into another. Up to that moment, he had been an engineer authenticating a machine, and that was a clean thing, a matter of metal and measurement and provable fact. What was wrapped in this oilcloth was not metal. It was a person, folded up and hidden inside a machine, and Keanu Reeves had spent the last 3 years learning more than he ever wanted to know about what it costs to be the one who finds what a dead man left behind. He had cleaned out Gus's barn alone. He had folded his sister's clothes into boxes. He knew the specific weight of an object that someone is no longer alive to explain, the way it sits in your hands heavier than its actual mass. And he felt that weight settle into the oilcloth bundle before he had unwrapped a single corner of it. The handwriting on the envelopes was a distinctive, slightly slanted script, and Keanu had seen it before because anyone who had followed the region's business news for 30 years had seen it. On foundation letters and signed documents, and the dedication plaques of buildings. It belonged to Arthur Sterling. Keanu sat down on the cold garage floor with the notebook unopened in his lap, suddenly aware that he was holding something far more personal than mechanical evidence. Something that belonged to a family's private history rather than to a collector's curiosity. He hesitated before he opened the cover. For the first time since he had begun, he felt a flicker of guilt, the sense of standing at the edge of a room he had not been invited into. And then he opened it, because Gus Hartley had also taught him that the truth deserves to be looked at, and he began to read. And what he read over the following hours rewrote everything he had assumed about the car and the man who had hidden it. Arthur Sterling had not bought this car the way collectors buy rare cars, at auction, with fanfare. According to the earliest entries, written in a younger and steadier hand than the later pages, he had spent nearly 30 years quietly protecting it, moving it between storage units under different names, paying a handful of mechanics under strict confidentiality just to keep it barely alive without ever restoring it. He had turned down offers that would have been life-changing for almost anyone, offers reaching into the millions, dismissing them without explanation, as though the money meant nothing next to whatever the car meant to him. And he believed, in notes that grew more urgent as the journal went on, that the car held a secret tied to a defining moment in automotive history, something far larger than its price. But that was not the part that kept Keanu on the cold floor until the light came gray through the garage windows. The part that kept him there was the rest of the notebook, because it was not really a businessman's journal at all. It was a father's apology, written to a daughter who would only ever read it after he was gone. Long before the company and the charity galas and the careful public face, the notebook said, Arthur Sterling had grown up with almost nothing, working double shifts as a young mechanic just to keep food on his family's table. And the prototype had come into his life during those early, desperate years, not bought but given, handed over to settle a debt by a struggling inventor who had no other way to pay Arthur for the work he had done. A man the notebook named only by his initials and described with a tenderness that suggested he had mattered. The car had become, for Arthur, a quiet symbol of everything he had clawed his way up from, a thing sitting in storage that reminded him, on the days he needed reminding, of how far he had come from counting coins for groceries. He never sold it because selling it would have meant selling the only honest thing left from the only honest years of his life. And as his fortune grew, and his responsibilities multiplied, and his life filled with boardrooms and deadlines, Arthur Sterling had watched himself drift further and further from his daughter. And he had grown terrified, the notebook said in handwriting that pressed harder into the page, that the very wealth he was building for her would turn her into someone who measured worth only as in dollars, the way he had watched that happen to so many other families. The notebook was a man wrestling privately with that fear for years, recording missed school plays and canceled dinners with a guilt he never found the courage to speak aloud, writing entries that read less like a businessman's records and more like a father's unspoken sorrow. Addressed to a daughter he was afraid he was losing to the empire he was building in her name. Keanu, read it the way you read something you know you will not be able to unread. And somewhere in the middle of it, he had to stop, because it had become unbearable in a way he had not expected. And the reason it had become unbearable was that he knew this man. Not Arthur Sterling personally, but this man, the one who hid the truest thing he had inside a machine because he could not find the words to say it out loud, who let the world think the most precious thing he owned was junk because contempt was the safest hiding place. Keanu had spent 60 years being taught by exactly that kind of man. Gus Hartley had been that kind of man. The notebook in his hands could have been written, in a different life, by the person who had made him. And he sat on the floor of his garage at 4 in the morning, a grieving man holding another grieving man's secret. And he understood, with a completeness that surprised him, exactly why Arthur Sterling had done what he had done, and exactly how alone he must have been to do it. There was one more thing, and it was the detail that made Keanu set the notebook down and sit very still for a long time. The struggling inventor, the one named only by initials, who had given Arthur the car to settle a debt in those early desperate years, was described in one late entry as a man who had taught Arthur that a machine remembers everything, that the things people think are just objects are never just objects. They are diaries written in steel. Keanu read that line 3 times. It was, very nearly word for word, a thing Gus Hartley used to say. He would never know for certain whether the two old men had ever crossed paths in that small, vanished world of people who loved dying machines, or whether it was simply a thing that men like them came to believe on their own, separately, in their separate barns. But sitting there in the gray light, Keanu chose to believe they had known each other, because the alternative, that there had been many such men and all of them were gone now, was somehow lonelier than he could stand that morning. He turned the idea over for days afterward, unable to leave it alone, and one evening he went into the old wooden box where he kept the few things of Gus's he could not part with, the worn tools, the dog-eared manuals, a single photograph of Gus as a young man Keanu had never been able to date. And he looked at that photograph for a long time, at the engine the young Gus was standing beside, and he could not make it be the prototype. The angle was wrong and the print too faded. And he was honest enough with himself to admit he was trying to force a connection. Because he wanted one. Because it would mean the two men who had shaped his life. And Arthur's had been, somewhere, the same man, and the world would be that much smaller and warmer, and less lonely. He never confirmed it. The initials in the notebook matched nothing he could prove. And he made his peace with not knowing, the way Gus had taught him to make peace with the questions a machine refuses to answer, by holding them gently instead of forcing them, and he put the photograph back in the box. But he kept the belief, privately, the way you keep a small light on in a far room of a house, not because you need it, but because the dark is easier to bear knowing it is there. It is worth saying, because it is the kind of thing that gets lost in a story about an $8 million car, that none of this had happened yet at the moment Keanu first knelt by that tarp. He could not have known any of it. He knelt by a wreck in a billionaire's garage because a curve of metal looked familiar. And he carried it home because he could not let a question go unanswered. And everything else, the notebook, the daughter, the slow thaw of a frozen woman, the academy full of throwaway kids learning to see value where the world saw junk, all of it flowed from one small refusal to look away from something everyone else had agreed was worthless. That is how it usually goes, Keanu thought later. The largest things turn on the smallest acts of attention. A man either looks under the tarp or he does not. Keanu understood that his own eye, however good, was not enough to settle a question of this size alone. He needed people whose credentials carried weight beyond his own quiet reputation as a small-town mechanic. So he photographed every detail from every angle, organized his notes into a timeline, and reached out to several established experts in vintage automobile history, sending careful emails late into the night after Heiress was asleep. The first responses were polite and dismissive, seasoned historians who had heard 100 stories like this, each one ending in disappointment, each one another, hopeful, amateur certain he had found something extraordinary that turned out to be nothing. After the fourth rejection, Keanu almost stopped, wondering if his grief and his exhaustion had led him to see meaning where there was none. But then a professor of 20th century automotive engineering, a woman named Adele Moreau, who worked with a respected university archive, called him personally after seeing his photographs, and her voice on the phone was measured but unmistakably urgent. And she asked, almost immediately, whether she could come see the car in person before anyone else got involved, because certain details in his photographs matched obscure records she had spent years trying to verify and never could. What followed over the next several days was unlike anything Keanu's modest garage had ever held. Professor Moreau arrived with two colleagues, both specialists, carrying equipment cases and reference materials more sophisticated than anything he owned. Together, they spent the better part of 2 days examining every inch of the car, comparing serial numbers against archived blueprints on laptops, testing metal composition with small handheld devices, cross-referencing the handwritten notes Keanu had found against historical company, records one of them had brought on an external drive. Keanu mostly stayed out of their way, which was its own kind of strange, because for 2 days his quiet garage was full of people who treated the thing he had found the way pilgrims treat a relic, and he was not used to his world being looked at by anyone, let alone looked at like this. He made them coffee. He answered their questions precisely and offered nothing he could not support. And more than once he watched one of the specialists arrive at a conclusion he had reached privately and say nothing. Because Gus had taught him that the work is not about being seen to be right, the work is about the thing being true. Professor Moreau noticed that, the not claiming, and at one point she looked at him over the engine bay with an expression he could not quite read and asked where he had trained. And Keanu Reeves said only that he had learned from an old man in a barn. And she had looked at him a moment longer, and then gone back to her instruments. But something in the room had shifted. The quiet respect of one serious person, recognizing another. The garage fell completely silent at one point. The only sound, the scratch of pens on clipboards and the occasional sharp intake of breath, as someone found another detail, confirming what they were all slowly beginning to believe. And finally, one of the specialists, an older man named Theodore Grant, whose name Keanu recognized from his own reference books, set down his tools and looked at Keanu with an expression somewhere between disbelief and reverence, and said, slowly, choosing each word as though afraid of overstating it, that if this was genuine, then they had just found the single most significant lost vehicle in the country's automotive history. A machine scholars had debated the existence of for 40 years, without a single confirmed sighting. He said it, and then the garage was quiet again, and Keanu found that he was not thinking about the money, or the history, or the name that would now be attached to this place. He was thinking that he wished Gus Hartley were alive to stand in this garage for 10 minutes, because Gus would have known exactly what this was the moment he saw it, and would have said almost nothing, and would have put one weathered hand on the fender, the way you greet an old friend you had given up hope of ever seeing again. Word did not stay contained. Despite everyone agreeing to keep it quiet until verification was complete, hushed conversations among collectors turned within days into public speculation in industry forums and trade publications. And the story began to spread well beyond the small circle of people who had stood in Keanu's garage. And it was a friend who first sent Camille Sterling the article, a brief electrifying piece describing the rediscovery of a legendary lost prototype in the hands of a private restorer, whose identity had not yet been disclosed. Camille read the headline twice, assuming it was a hoax, some bit of clickbait for a niche industry desperate for excitement. Her skepticism lasted exactly until she scrolled down to the photograph, a grainy image of a familiar rusted frame under fluorescent lights. The same dented fender she had glanced at without curiosity her whole childhood, the same faded badge she had once joked looked like something pulled from a junkyard. Her breath caught. This was the exact car she had thrown at the quiet man in the worn jacket as a joke, the one she had practically begged him to take off her hands, the one she had dismissed in front of a laughing crowd, without a single thought about what it might be. And here is where Camille Sterling does the thing that keeps her human, the thing that makes her arc more than a fairy tale. because her first instinct was not remorse. Her first instinct was that she had been robbed. She set the phone down and felt, rising through the shock, a hot certainty that something of hers had been taken, that this man, this nobody, had walked off with a fortune that belonged to her family, and that he must have known, must have seen it, must have manipulated the whole humiliating exchange, to trick her into giving away something priceless. By the next morning, she had called her father's longtime estate attorney, a careful and discreet man named Edmund Hale, who had managed Arthur's private affairs for over 20 years, and she had asked him, coldly, what it would take to get the car back, whether the gift could be challenged, whether a verbal transfer in front of witnesses could be undone. Edmund Hale listened to all of it, and then he was quiet for a moment, and then he told her two things that changed the shape of her anger. The first was that the gift was almost certainly valid, witnessed by 40 people, freely given, and that any attempt to claw it back would be both legally difficult and, in his careful lawyer's phrasing, extraordinarily unwise for her public reputation. And the second thing, which he said more gently, was that the car had indeed attracted serious interest from international collectors for decades, with documented offers reaching into the millions, all of which Arthur had quietly and consistently refused, never once explaining why, not even to Edmund, who had known him for 20 years. It was the second thing that stopped her. The first made her angry. The second made her go quiet because it did not fit. A man does not turn down millions of dollars, again and again for 30 years, for a pile of junk. Either her father had been a fool, which she knew he was not, or there was something here she did not understand about him, which, she was beginning to realize, was most of him. She sat in her father's study that night, surrounded by the heavy bookshelves and framed photographs that had always felt more like museum pieces than belongings. And she did something she had not done since his funeral. She tried to remember him, not the public man, not the name on the buildings, the actual man. And she found that she could not really, that she had spent her whole life observing him from a careful, polished distance, and that the distance had been so complete that she did not actually know why he had kept a rusted car in a corner for 30 years. And that this not knowing was, she understood with a slowly sinking feeling, a small piece of a much larger not knowing that described her entire relationship with her father. And the desire that rose in her then was not for the first time in a long time, a desire to take something or win something. It was a desire to understand, and she did not know how to do that from a position of power, because she had never had to ask anyone for anything. And the only person who could help her understand was a man she had humiliated in front of a laughing crowd over the very thing she now needed his help to understand. When Camille arrived at Keanu's garage the following afternoon, she had dressed down, jeans and a plain sweater, in what was either an attempt to seem less imposing or an attempt to feel like a different person. She was not sure which. She found him exactly where the article described, among tools and reference books spread across a workbench that had clearly become the center of an ongoing investigation. He looked up when she came in. He did not look surprised, and he did not look triumphant, and for a moment she almost wished he would, because triumph she would have known how to answer. She started where her world always started, with money. She offered to buy the car back, and she named a figure that would have widened most people's eyes, a number far higher than anything she had ever expected to pay for something she had recently considered worthless. Keanu listened politely. He set down the wrench in his hand, and he shook his head, gently, and told her that his refusal had nothing to do with greed, and nothing to do with driving the price up. What he wanted, he told her, looking at her with the same calm he had shown the night she humiliated him, was simply to understand why her father had guarded this one car so fiercely for 30 years, when he could have sold it, or displayed it, or let it fade into obscurity like 100 other machines. Wealthy men accumulate and forget. He did not want her money. He wanted, he said, to give her something instead, and he did not say what, and she did not understand yet, and he gestured to a chair. Camille, who had walked in braced for a negotiation, and found instead a man who wanted nothing from her, stood in the doorway of his garage for a long moment, unsure how to respond to a request that asked for understanding rather than profit. And then she sat down, and Keanu set the worn leather notebook on the workbench between them and told her, quietly, that he thought she should be the one to read it, that it belonged to her family and not to him, and that he had read enough of it to know that her father had been a very different man than the one the world had been allowed to see. And the two of them sat on mismatched chairs under the fluorescent lights that had witnessed every stage of his careful work, and they began to read, page by page, late into the evening. What emerged from those pages over the following hours was a portrait of Arthur Sterling that neither of them had fully understood. The double shifts, the struggling inventor and the debt and the car given in place of money he could not pay, the 30 years of quiet protection. And then, as the entries went on, the fear, the father's terror that his wealth would hollow out his daughter, the missed school plays recorded with guilt, the canceled dinners, the man wrestling privately for years with how to love a child he was steadily losing to the very empire he was building for her. Camille read entries describing quiet pride in small things she barely remembered telling him, an essay she had written in the 3rd grade about kindness, a copy of which, the notebook said, he had kept folded inside the back cover. She turned to the back cover. It was there. A child's essay about kindness, folded into careful quarters kept by a billionaire for 30 years in the one place he kept the truest things he had. She began to cry, quietly at the workbench, and Keanu did not say much, did not rush her, simply let her have the space to absorb what she was discovering, the way you let a person stand in the rain when the rain is the only thing that will help. Moments she had spent her whole life filing under neglect were revealing themselves as something else. Not neglect, but a man genuinely lost. A man who did not know how to bridge a distance that his own success had carved, and who had finally written down, in a notebook hidden in a car he disguised as junk, everything he had never found the courage to say out loud while he was alive to say it. There was a moment, deep in the notebook, that broke something open in her that had been closed for 30 years. It was an entry from the night of the recital, the one she had never told anyone she remembered. The headlights that did not come. Her father had written about it. He had written that he had sat in his office that evening with the recital program in his hand, a program someone had mailed him, and that he had not been able to make himself leave the desk. Not because the work was so urgent, but because he had convinced himself by then that he was a thing that ruined what it touched. That his daughter was better off with the version of him that arrived on video than the distracted, exhausted, frightened version that would have arrived in person. And that this was, he wrote, the great lie he told himself for 20 years, the lie that his absence was a gift. He had been wrong, he wrote, near the bottom of the page, in handwriting that had begun to shake. He had been so wrong, and he did not know how to fix it now, and he was afraid it was too late, and he was writing it here, because here was the only place he had ever been brave. Camille read that entry and put her hand over her mouth, because she had spent 30 years believing her father had not come to the recital because she did not matter to him. And the truth, the actual truth in his own hand, was that he had not come because she mattered to him more than he knew how to carry. The two facts had lived in the same house her whole life, the same night, the same dark driveway, and she had only ever been allowed to seize one of them. And now, 8 years too late to tell him she understood, she was finally being shown the other. Keanu watched her read it. He did not know which entry had done it, but he knew the shape of what was happening, because he had done his own version of it on the cold garage floor at 4 in the morning. And he knew there was nothing to say. And he knew that the kindest thing he could do was to be a person in the room who was not looking away. So he stayed. He let her cry. And when she finally looked up at him, her face wrecked and open in a way it had certainly never been in any photograph, he did not offer her comfort, which would have been about making himself feel useful. He simply nodded. The small nod of one person who has stood in the rain telling another that yes, this is how it feels. And yes, you will survive it. And no, it does not stop mattering. And that was the most honest thing anyone had given Camille Sterling in a very long time. News of the rediscovered prototype reached an international auction house that specialized in historically significant vehicles. And within weeks they had organized a formal sale, drawing serious collectors and institutional buyers from across the world, men who flew in on private jets to witness what the trade publications were already calling the discovery of the decade. The auction room buzzed with quiet anticipation as the bidding opened, paddles rising cautiously at first and then with startling speed. 1 million passed in the first few minutes, almost casually, as though the room were still adjusting to the reality of what stood under the lights. 3 million followed. Then 5. The tension climbing with each bid as the collectors understood they were watching history happen in real time rather than attending another transaction. At 7 million, only 2 bidders remained, trading offers back and forth with controlled intensity, while the rest of the room watched in hushed silence. And the final bid came from a European industrialist who had reportedly hunted this exact vehicle for over a decade, his calm voice cutting through the tension as he offered $8,720,000, a figure that drew an audible gasp before the gavel came down with a crack that seemed to echo through the hall. A record. The room erupted into applause that shook the chandeliers. Camille sat near the back, beside Keanu, and the tears on her face had nothing to do with the staggering sum now attached to her father's secret. Nothing to do with the money, which would, through the strange path the car had taken, end up benefiting no one she had expected. She was crying because for the first time since the funeral she finally understood the man her father had truly been beneath the public face. She had spent her whole life watching from a polished distance. She had come into that room the daughter of a billionaire. She understood, sitting there, that she had never actually been that. She had been the daughter of a frightened young mechanic who had gotten very rich and very lost and had loved her, the whole time, in a language she had never learned to read. In the days after the auction, Keanu did a thing that surprised everyone who heard about it. The money from the sale was complicated, tangled in questions about the original gift and the estate and the disguised provenance, and there were lawyers who could have spent years fighting about who was truly owed what. Keanu did not fight about it. He gathered Arthur Sterling's complete notebook, along with the photographs and the letters hidden in the car, the third-grade essay about kindness, all of it, and he handed the entire collection back to Camille without asking for anything in return, explaining simply that these belonged to her family's history rather than to him, regardless of where he had happened to find them. And here the story refuses to be tidy, the way true things refuse to be tidy. Because the money did not all flow to Camille, and it did not all flow to Keanu, and the question of who deserved what was never cleanly answered, and some of it went to the estate, and some to the auction house, and some into the gray machinery that swallows such fortunes, and the part that did eventually come to Keanu, a real sum but far less than the headline number, he did not keep either. He used it to turn the leased garage into something larger, a proper restoration academy, several work bays where young people from hard backgrounds could learn the trade, could learn to bring dead machines back to life the way Gus Hartley had once taught a half-lost young man in a barn. He did it quietly, with no press release. He did it, though he never said so to anyone, for Gus and for Arthur Sterling, 2 old men who had understood the same thing about machines and about love, and had both, in the end, kept the truest part of themselves hidden, where no one would think to look. The academy filled faster than he expected. They came from the shelter program, and the county school, and the courts. Kids who had been told in 100 quiet ways that they were not worth much, and Keanu Reeves did with them exactly what Gus had done with him, which was to set a ruined thing in front of them, and wait, and let them be wrong, and refuse to rescue them from the productive frustration of a problem that did not care how they felt about it. He was not warm in the way the brochures of such places promise. He was something better and rarer, which was reliable. He showed up. He remembered what each of them had struggled with the week before. He did not lie to them about their work, because Gus had never lied to him. And the kids learned within a month that praise from this quiet man meant something precisely because he did not hand it out, and that a single nod from him over a clean weld was worth more than a stranger's applause. Heiress came to the academy on weekends and did her homework in the corner office and grew up, without anyone deciding it, in a building full of people learning to see value in things the world had thrown away, which was, Keanu thought sometimes, not the worst thing a girl could be surrounded by. Camille's change did not happen in a night, and the story is better for that. Over the year that followed, she circled back to her old life and found it did not fit anymore, and she circled towards something new and was often clumsy at it. She restructured large parts of her father's foundation, took personal oversight of programs that supported struggling families and trade workers, the very people she had once treated as background noise. She made herself learn the names of employees throughout the company, from the executives down to the people who cleaned the building at night, long after everyone else had gone home, and some of her old friends drifted away, calling her boring, and she found to her own surprise that she did not miss them. The learning of the names was harder than it sounds, and it is worth saying why, because it is the part that was real. The first time Camille Sterling tried to thank the man who cleaned her office floor, she got his name wrong, and he corrected her with the wary politeness of someone who has learned that when the powerful suddenly notice you, it usually means trouble. And she went home that night feeling like a fraud, feeling that she was performing decency the way she had once performed everything else. And she nearly stopped. The thing that kept her going was a sentence from the notebook, the one about remembering that the people serving champagne at your parties have stories as real as your own. And she realized that the point was not to feel good about noticing people. The point was simply to notice them, whether or not it made her feel like a better person, whether or not anyone gave her credit, and that the credit wanting was the old disease and the noticing was the cure, and that she would probably be fighting the one to practice the other for the rest of her life. So she learned the man's name, Marcus. And the next week she learned the name of the woman at the front security desk, and the week after that, the names of the people in the mailroom, and, slowly, clumsily, with many small failures, Camille Sterling built the one thing her father's money had never been able to buy her, which was a reason for other people to be in her life that had nothing to do with what she could give them or take from them. She was not a saint about it. She backslid, caught herself being cold, corrected, tried again. It was not a transformation. It was the slow, unglamorous work of a person actually changing, which is harder and rarer than any sudden epiphany, and which looks, from the outside, like very little, and which is, from the inside, like learning to walk on a leg you never knew you had. She funded scholarships with no announcements attached. She attended board meetings now with notes in the margins about how a decision might land on the people who exactly did the work, a habit that visibly unsettled executives accustomed to a very different version of her. And more than once she watched a proposal that would have looked clean on a spreadsheet and ugly in a break room, and she killed it, and she did not explain herself. And the executives learned, slowly, that the new Camille could not be managed the way the old one could, because the old one had wanted to be admired, and the new one had stopped caring, and a person who has stopped needing your admiration is a person you cannot control. The losses, though. The losses stayed losses, because that is what they do. Arthur Sterling was still dead, and he had still never said any of it out loud, and Camille would carry for the rest of her life the particular grief of being loved deeply by someone who could not tell her, and of only learning it when telling him back had become impossible. The 30 years were gone, and no auction returned them. And Gus Hartley was still gone, too, and Keanu's sister, and the quiet house at the edge of the mountains still held one man and one 9-year-old girl, and the shape of all the people who were not there. No record price fixes any of that. The machine remembers everything, Gus used to say, and the trouble with a thing that remembers everything is that it remembers the losses, too. and keeps them, and hands them back to you on quiet mornings when you least expect it. A year after the auction, Camille came back to the academy one last time, on an ordinary afternoon, and she found Keanu where she expected to find him, hands stained with grease, kneeling beside an old engine while a teenager from a local shelter program watched over his shoulder, Keanu explaining the function of each part, with the same quiet steadiness he had shown the night she humiliated him, without a word of protest. She thanked him, sincerely, not for the money, which had honestly complicated as much as it had helped, but for unintentionally guiding her toward the father she had spent her whole life only partly knowing. And then she asked him the question that had followed her quietly for a year, ever since the first night reading the notebook alone in her father's study. She asked what he thought would have happened if she had never thrown him those keys, if she had never made that careless, cruel joke in front of a laughing crowd. Keanu paused his work. He wiped his hands on a worn cloth, and he gave her a small, knowing smile, the smile of a man who had asked himself the same question more than once, and he said, simply, "Then you would never have known who your father really was." The words settled between them with a quiet weight, and neither of them rushed to fill the silence. And they both turned, briefly, toward a photograph that hung now near the entrance of the academy, a thing Camille had given Keanu, and asked him to hang. A young and hopeful Arthur Sterling, captured decades before the wealth, standing beside an old engine with grease-stained hands and a genuine smile she had almost never seen on him in life. The greatest thing her father left behind, they both seemed to understand without saying it, was never the $8,720,000 that finally surfaced after 30 years of careful silence. It was the lesson buried under all of it, about humility and about kindness and about the true measure of a person, which no auction price, however historic, could ever quite capture or replace. I keep going back to the badge, not the notebook, not the auction, not the $8,720,000. The badge on the grill, the wrong one, the one Arthur Sterling swapped on, so that the most precious thing he owned would look like junk to anyone who glanced at it. I keep thinking about the particular loneliness of a man who hides his treasure inside contempt, who decides that the safest way to protect the truest thing he has is to make the whole world believe it is worthless. Arthur did it with a car. Gus Hartley, I suspect, did it with his whole gruff silence. Maybe a lot of us do it, in smaller ways every day. We disguise the thing we care about most, so that no one can take it or laugh at it. And then we are surprised and alone when no one sees it. When even our own children glance at the most important thing in the garage and see only rust. Camille looked at that car her entire childhood and never once asked her father why he kept it. He never once found the words to tell her. And the only reason any of it ever came to light was that a stranger in a worn jacket happened to know that a machine remembers everything, and happened to care enough to look under the tarp. That is the part that stays with me, not the fortune. The 40 years it sat in a corner, wearing the wrong face, waiting for one person who knew how to see it. While this story is fictional, the lessons about how easily we mistake the value of a person, or a thing, or a quiet man in a worn jacket, by the surface we are too hurried to look past, are very real. Thank you for following this story. Let us know in the comments below. If this story has moved you and you'd like to stand with us in bringing more voices of truth and hope to light, please consider supporting our work. Even the smallest gift helps us continue creating and sharing these powerful stories. You can find the donate link in the description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe, so you won't miss the next chapter we're preparing for you.